Narayana Namaha. Hello and welcome to Kaliyuga Dharma. In today's episode, we'll be taking off from where we left our last episode on the origin of Mlecha races. We left off with a mention of Indo-European languages. In today's episode, we'll be seeing how Sanatana Dharma's view on civilizations of humans and the languages they speak, how it differs from modernist views on civilization and evolution of languages. Now, before I go into the Sanatani view, I would like to just go have a brief overview on what modern ethno-linguists believe about languages and the evolution of languages and civilizations of humans. Now, over here, we have a picture of a tree whose roots, whose branches and whose leaves are termed as various languages. But if you see the root, it's called Indo-European. And there's a small sub tree growing below this tree on the right side, on the bottom right, called Uralic. And it also has various branches and it also has various leaf clusters. Now, in this, if you see Sanskrit on the top, somewhere towards the top left, below Avadhi, if you see Sanskrit is a small bud and it is emerging out of something, a trunk known as Indo-Aryan, and that is emerging out of a bigger trunk called Indo-Iranian, and that is emerging out of a root called Indo-European. Where did the modernist linguists actually get these ideas from, that this is how languages evolved? We need to understand this in order to go into the Sanatani view and see why it fundamentally differs. Now, modernists, they compare the sounds of words between various languages, the phonetics, and they map how similar sounding words for the same thing means that a certain group of languages can be clustered as one group. They also go to the next level of observing grammatical similarities, that is how verbs are conjugated, how sentence structures are made, genders that are assigned to objects within those languages, grammar systems. And then they go one step above that and they try to see similarities between the religious beliefs of the speakers of those languages and the religious beliefs of their civilizations. And they try to draw comparisons between, if this civilization has a religious belief that's very similar to that civilization, there is some kind of a connect between them. So they make these various surface level connections, and they also try to see whether there are historical documents that talk about migration from one place to another place, and whether any verifiable source text exists written hundreds or thousands of years ago corroborating that there were some tribes that lived in A and they moved to a place B, and in B today we see a language that is very similar to the language spoken in A, and therefore they try to draw parallel on maybe this kind of movement of people created this civilization and this civilization came out of that civilization. Then there's also the genetic mapping that they do. Now, this is very controversial because there are various uh, sentiments associated to genetic mapping. Some people don't like to believe that they are descendants of some other people, and some people like to believe that they are descendants of some other people. But we are not going to get into the controversies. We are just going to see this very, very objectively. The problem with genetic mapping is that humans are a very varied group of creatures, and the modern scientists' problem in genetic mapping will arise from the fact that the modern linguist will also believe in the modern theories on evolution, that humans came from a race of apes known as the Homo sapiens. And despite coming from one race of apes, they somehow became genetically very diverse. So, how did a singular race of apes, which had a very similar gene pool, give rise to so many gene types of humans? Is a self contradiction that the modern ethno-linguist cannot answer. And then there are these various nationalistic sentiments attached to the whole gene mapping thing, the eugenics, and therefore that becomes a doorway to controversy. And it also becomes a doorway to political narrative building. But this is broadly the basis on which modernist ethno-linguists have created their theories on how languages have evolved. Now, I've given over here a run-up of various so-called Indo-European languages and how in each language the word for the number 2 is said. You can see it for yourself. And below, I've also noted certain religious similarities and certain commonly cited religious beliefs that modern ethno-linguists try to use to draw parallels between these civilizations. For example, starting from left to right, that's a picture of the leftmost picture is a picture of Indra killing the demon Vritrasura. The second picture is a painting of the Norse god Odin, the supreme god of the Norse, Odin, killing the frost giant Ymir. The third picture is a picture of the Zoroastrian hero Afredun killing the demon serpent Ajdaha. And the fourth picture is a sculpture of the Armenian pre-Christian god Vahagan killing the demon serpent Vishap. Now, in all of this, there is a deity killing a serpent and bringing some good to the world, with the exception of, say, Ymir. Ymir was not a serpent, a frost giant. But if you see, while on the surface of it, these religious beliefs look very similar, they're actually very different. In the story of Indra and Vritra in the Bhagavata Purana and in various other Puranas where it's mentioned, Vritra is a reincarnation of a king Chitraketu, and Vritra becomes Sharanagata of Sriman Narayana, and by getting killed by Indra, Vishnu takes the form of Indra's Vajra and not only kills Indra, but not only kills Vritra, but he also gives Vritra Vaikuntha Gati. Now, the dimension of karma, Vaikuntha, and the supreme god called Sriman Narayana giving mukti to an asura called Vritra, if you see, these elements are not present in any of the other stories of Odin and Ymir, of Afredun and Ajdaha, or of Vishap and Vahagan. If you see the story of Ymir and Odin, Ymir was generated by a cosmic imbalance, and in order to bring balance, Odin had to slay him. It was a story of cosmic imbalance. In the story of Afredun and Ajdaha in the Zoroastrian religious texts, Ajdaha was a good human king at the beginning. He got corrupted by the supreme embodiment of evil in Zoroastrianism, that is Angra Ahriman. He became evil, he became a demonically possessed human ruler, and in order to rid the earth of his tyranny, Afredun had to kill him. There is no element of karma or cosmic imbalance, or none of that is present over here. And there is definitely no involvement of a supreme god giving mukti to Ajdaha over here. And then in the case of Vahagan and Vishap, the story is almost entirely lost to us. Vahagan is the Armenian name for the Zoroastrian Varatragna. Before Christianity, most Armenians followed Zoroastrianism. And just the way Afredun kills Ajdaha, the Armenian Varatragna or Vahagan kills a serpent, Vishap, and nothing more is known, and some good results in the world. The story is almost largely lost. We see that even though at the surface level, the stories are very, very similar, when you dig a little deeper, they are like chalk and cheese. They're totally different from one another. But Indo-European linguists, they come to conclusion based on these surface level comparisons of grammar, of phonetics, and of religious beliefs at a very, very surface level. And they come to a conclusion that they all came from a single source, and that source lies somewhere in Eurasia, and from Eurasia they spread everywhere else. Migration was the only reason how evolution of these languages happened. That all Indo-European peoples' religions also come from the same source, and somehow they all differed. These theorists' conclusions are based on a very flimsy evidence. And the problem with this is that beyond a point, there is no verifiable historical text, there is no verifiable methodology to prove that these are indeed true. We can't go back in a time machine and see any of this. Now, with this, we go into the Vedantic viewpoint of how human civilizations and languages evolved and how they differ. The Sanatani view of human languages does not go into civilizations, genetics, religious beliefs at the surface level, comparison of phonology of words, of grammar, none of that. It goes to an even more fundamental level, sound. And sound in Sanatana Dharma is a manifestation of the guna of the maker of the sound. And the gunas of the maker of the sound comes from the karma of the maker of the sound. Thus, no two dogs will bark the same. One dog will be more rajasic, one dog will be more sattvic. Our dog owners will know this very, very well. That a gentler dog will bark very differently from a ferocious dog. No two cats will mew the same. And in the same way, if we see across Sanatana Dharmic Puranas and Itihasas, when we see animals communicating, we see them communicating in no different way than the way in which humans communicate. The same way, no two humans sound the same. The same way, no two humans no two humans speaking the same language sound the same. In the very same way, no two entities in nature sound the same. Why? Because they have different karma. Different karma gives them different gunas, and different gunas make them emit different shabdas and swaras. About the origin of sound in nature as a medium of manifesting the Jivatman's guna, the Pancharatra Agama Shastra says a lot. From the body of Narayana, Shri herself emits sound in the form of Shabda Brahman. And when we say she emits sound, she lays the basis of the existence of something called sound. She creates the concept of sound. And because the Jivatmans within Prakriti are of diverse karmic trajectories, she lays the basis of sound and she allows these Jivatmans to morph those sounds into whatever their own gunas, according to their own karmas, allow them to morph it into. Thus, sounds come from the body of Sriman Narayana. They come not only as alphabetic sounds, but they also come as intonations, swaras. When we hear the recitation of Vedas, we hear that it's recited in a certain tune. So when we say a, e, these are all just alphabet sounds. But we can also make them in tunes. For example, a word that keeps recurring during yajnas and havans and all. Swaha, a. Why does the extra a come at the end? Because it's a rule that during invocations, that particular word has to be recited in that particular way, and therefore it gives a certain, it evokes a certain power of Sriman Narayana to that yajna and makes a certain spiritual benefit come out of it. And mind you, not anyone and everyone can make that sound. It is only a particular person of a particular karma that can make that sound. That's why we say those who do not wear the Janayu, non-Yajnopavitis, cannot make the sounds of the way of the Vedas, because their karma set will not allow those sounds to bear the necessary spiritual fruit. How will they gain the same spiritual fruit? Just simply reciting the names of Bhagavan without necessarily making any of these Veda swaras. In every step of the way, whatever sound we make, whether it's a sound of a language, even when I cough, even when I sneeze, even when I'm calling out to someone by saying something like, hey, the sound of my voice carries my gunas in it. And therefore, even a sound that necessarily does not have a fixed meaning, it evokes a certain guna in nature, and that in turn makes me gain more karma for it. Which is why we are told in Sanatani households to never speak bad words. Why? Because those sounds are Rajo Tamasika in nature. They evoke Sriman Narayana to bestow Rajo Tamasic gunas back on us in return, and therefore we will commit more sins. Therefore, whichever sound we make with our mouths or with our hands, those should only be Satvika sounds. Sounds come with implications. And this forms the basis of how a language is created in Sanatana Dharmic viewpoint. Fundamental sounds appear from Sriman Narayana, and thereafter the speakers of these sounds, in accordance to their gunas, will make the sounds change. So in Sanskrit, the Shuddha Satvika language of Sanskrit, there are a certain set of sounds, but in Prakriti, those sounds can be morphed and changed. That's why there are foreign languages have sounds like za or ja, which don't exist in Sanskrit. For example, in French you have je, in Russian you have je, you have za in Arabic and Persian, Hungarian, in Germanic, you have a tha in German. and you have za in Italian. You don't have any of these sounds in Sanskrit. Why? Because these do not fall within the Shuddha Sattvika boundary of Sanskrit. Outside those boundaries. The same way Mlechas fall outside the Sanatani boundary. And thus, just the way Sanskrit sounds represent the gunas of the Sanskrit speaker, Mlecha sounds represent the guna of the Mlecha speaker. And thus, the creation of new words and sounds do not prove anything about migration theory or conquest of one civilization by another. They just tell you that those are the gunas of those people, period. If you see a person discarding Sanskrit and calling it old fashioned despite being by birth a Brahmin, and instead wanting to migrate to another country and speak their language, you know that despite being born in a Brahmin family, that particular Jivatman's prarabdha karma has so much, it has a certain kind of karma phala in it that makes the sharira of that human being more rajotamasika, making that human discard a sattvika way of speaking and go to a place and speak in a rajasic way, and probably in the future that person will adopt that place's religion, that place's mores and ethics. And this is how civilizations got created in history from the Sanatani point of view. We saw in the last video on Mlecha races how civilizations came up. We cannot really go into the level of proving that a migration took place in this way, genetics changed in this way. No, we can't prove it, because to categorically prove it, we actually need a time machine to go and see it. We just, modern linguists second guess and try to say that, okay, a migration probably took place like this. But in Sanatana Dharma, we don't get into that level, because that leads us into a mess. How will you prove it? If you can't prove it, you got to keep quiet. So instead of getting into that level, we just stop at the level of saying it shows the gunas, full stop. Sanatana Dharma, most importantly, does not box languages in families and streams like Indo-European, Uralic, Turkic, Semitic. No. But modern linguists do. And thus the modern linguist cannot say how, despite humans coming from the same group of apes called Homo sapiens, how is it that they developed so many different language streams, so different from one another? Whereas the Sanatani can easily tell you that, yeah, one group of people, they just adopted a certain kind of gunas, and those gunas impelled them to make certain kinds of sounds to describe certain things, and that's it. They ended up creating words that are very, very different from the words that another civilization uses. While saying all of this, Sanatana Dharma does not entirely reject the conclusions to which modern linguists arrive at. For example, Sanatana Dharma will not say that migrations of humans does not occur. Of course, they do occur. We see that in our own Puranas and Itihasas. Sanatana Dharma will not go to the extent of saying that one civilization never conquered another. We see that even in our Itihasas and Puranas. But Sanatana Dharma does not want to get into, the Sanatana Dharmic scriptures do not want to get into that, into the mess of making a theory and then going after proving it. It stops at the level of gunas. Based on Vedantic readings of how languages evolve and how human speakers make their own words and sounds that come out of their mouths evolve, I have taken some examples. For example, the word for marriage, I have chosen three very different languages from three totally different streams. The first word evlenmek is Anatolian Turkish. It comes from the Oghuz West Turkic stream of Turkic languages. Whereas the word for marriage in Hungarian, Hazoshit, it comes from the Finno-Uralic group of languages, which is neither Turkic nor Indo-European. And then you have Vivaha, Sanskrit, so-called Indo-European word for language. Now, if you so-called Indo-European Sanskrit word for marriage. Now, if you see, these three words are entirely different from one another, but what do these three words actually mean? They don't mean marriage, so to speak. If you take the Turkish word evlenmek, it comes from the root ev. Evlen literally means house. Ev refers to house, a home. Evlen literally means to be housed or to be domesticated. Evlenmek literally means to get housed with someone. So in Turkish, when you say I'm marrying this person, what you're trying to say is actually I'm taking up a house with this person. Similarly, Hazoshit in Hungarian comes from the Hungarian root has, which means a house. Hazoshit literally means the same thing as Evlenmek, to take up a house. Vivaha comes from the root vah. Vah means to move around. That's why Rathavaha literally means charioteer, one who Ratham Vahayati iti Rathavaha. Vaha means one who moves around something. Vivaha literally means one who stops moving around, that is settles down. So Vivaha, like Hazoshit and Evelyn Mek, literally means to settle down. So the Turk, the Magyar, and the Sanskrit speaker, all three of them referred to marriage as settling down. So although they were in three totally different parts of the world with very different civilizational dynamics for thousands of years, they viewed marriage the same way. And that is what the Pancharatra Agama Shastra says about humans, that they are all imbued with the same intelligence. Although over yugas they may drift apart. The same way, when humans observe things in nature despite living in different civilizations, they make similar words for it. For example, if you see, the Icelandic word for river and the Hungarian word for river are very, very similar, although the Icelandic people are descendants of Vikings, whereas the Hungarians come from somewhere in the Ural Mountains in Siberia. They're not even related to each other yet. They have similar words. They somehow, and words that spring out of these words are also similar in meaning. For example, the word for river is used by Hungarians also to refer to the continuation of something. The word for continuing in Hungarian is folitini, whereas the word for river is folio. To show the flowing nature of something, the continuous nature of something, they use the same root foli. The same way in Icelandic, it's fleot. In English, it's flow. In Sanskrit, if you see, for example, it's very it's very interesting to note that the root to blow is va. That's why vayu literally means that which blows, wind. Va is the root to denote blowing or flowing of something. And you can see the same way vata in Sanskrit refers to wind. You have water, you have avato. Avato in Gothic is both for water as well as it's sometimes used for wind also. You have Vad in Parthian, which comes from the Avestan Vata. Vata is also a Zoroastrian deity of Ahura Mazda, which fights against evil demons in the Zoroastrian cosmology. Vata, Vayu Vata is a deity in Zoroastrianism. And in Slavonic, the word for water is Vod, from where you get the word for an inferior form of water, vodka. The ka in vodka refers to an inferior form of water. Culturally speaking, the Slavs used to consider alcohol as an inferior form of water, and therefore vod or water becomes a vodka, which has now become a universal drink today across the earth. There are humans drink this drink without even actually giving any thought to the fact that the word for this drink comes from the word for water itself, and they all come back to the Sanskrit va, from where vayu and vata come. So we can see again that so many diverse civilizations, they viewed the same thing the similar way despite being separated by so many miles in both time as well as in geographic distance. This doesn't mean that everything came from Sanskrit necessarily, but it also does not mean that nothing came from Sanskrit. The truth is somewhere in the middle, is what the Vedantic way of reasoning is, and that's exactly what we try to say over here. Can we conclude that this word came from that word? No. But can we conclude that this word had nothing to do with that word? No. The Greek materas, for example, it probably is influenced by the Sanskrit matru. As far as Sanatana Dharma is concerned, we would say that yeah, the Yavanas did come from Vasishta's cow, which itself was equal to power equal in power to a Brahma Rishi, and therefore the Yavanas who become the ancestors of the Greeks later on, their language is directly a derivation of Sanskrit. This is how the Sanatani would reason it, and according to his scripture, it's not wrong for him to reason this way. However, does it mean that nothing else has influenced the evolution of Greek as we know it today? No. Sanatana Dharma does not even say that. It says, it in fact doesn't say anything. There is no linguistic theory in Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma offers us a view on how sound is created by Parabrahman, how Parabrahman allows creatures to use sound as a medium of communication according to their own guna and karma, and it allows us to observationally come to our own conclusions by ourselves, thereby not rigidly boxing things into rigid theories that do not have any way to reason out with anomalies and exceptions that occur to rules. Humans, according to the modern evolutionary theory, come from a singular race of apes. Whereas in Sanatana Dharma, they come from the Gotras of various rishis. Mlecha races come from diverse sources, such as one is Vasishtha's cow, fallen Sanatanis themselves, the marriage between these two groups, and then more races arise out of intermingling. And Bhishma himself says in the Anushasana Parva of Mahabharata that human civilizations can technically be, human jati types can technically be infinite, asankhyeya in number, because the intermarriage between any two varnas can lead to more and more varna types being formed in nature. And therefore, while infinite types of varna types can exist, infinite types of guna types can exist in humans, infinite types of civilizational and linguistic types can also exist, is a conclusion to which we observationally come. It is not categorically stated in the Vedantic texts. Thus, the view on how humans originated and became into civilizations is extremely broad based in Sanatana Dharma, whereas the modern theories on how languages and civilizations and humans themselves came into existence and then evolved is pretty narrow and based on just mapping of surface level similarities without going into the guna and the karma level of the jivatmans that take the form of those humans and make those sounds and those noises and thereby create those languages. And then there's always a self-contradiction of saying that man came from one, all men in the world came from, all men and women came from one race of apes, and yet we are so different. Why is the man in China looking so different from the man in Hungary? Why is the man in Hungary so different from the man in Alaska? Why is the man in Alaska so different from the man in India? If they all came from the same group of apes. So on one level you want to say that they came from the same race of creatures, but on another level they all became totally different. I mean, how is that even possible? The genetic similarities among humans by this theory should be the genetic similarities should be much more than the genetic differences, but evidence shows that it's not. Whereas Sanatana Dharma says that humans have diverse sources. They come from diverse Brahma Rishis and Prajapatis. They follow the law of a very special avatar of Vishnu known as Manu. And then some humans also come from a cow, a Brahma Rishi which came in the form of Vasishta's cow. And then these humans from these various diverse sources intermarried over millions of years called yugas, and then they gave rise to various civilizations. And because those civilizations, again, the people in therein will have their own gunas and their own karmas, they make different sounds and create their own languages. We do not try to get into the mess of how each and every language came, each and every group of humans came. We just leave it at this level. Why do Sanatana Dharmic scriptures not go into the level of seeing how each and every civilization came, how each and every language came into existence? Because that is contradictory to the purpose of Sanatana Dharma, which is aimed at teaching a soul how to move closer to Sriman Narayana. And when our objective in Sanatana Dharma is to reach Sriman Narayana, realizing that this body is just an external shell, these civilizations are all Mohamaya. They will exist today, they will not exist tomorrow. In reality, what is the reality is our soul within us, and the soul is the property of Sriman Narayana, and it must reach his lotus feet in Vaikuntha. When this is what Sanatana Dharma's ultimate aim is, all else is useless. Knowing whether the Visigoth came from the Ostrogoth or knowing whether the Hungarian is a descendant of the Mongol, it does not matter. And therefore our scriptures, they leave it to our conclusion and they will not go further into it because it is counterproductive to the spiritual goal of Sanatana Dharma, which is making the Jivatman leave the cycle of birth and death. Sanatana Dharma treats the deities that occur in the Vedas and in Vedantic scriptures as real. And all our conclusions on whatever we conclude about the evolution of human civilizations and languages are based on this premise that deities are real. Modern Indo-European linguistic theory would tell you that deities are imaginary. The Zoroastrian deities as imaginary as the Vedic Hindu deities as imaginary as the Viking deity, but they all come from the same Eurasian group of people known as Proto-Indo-Europeans who created their own gods and goddesses out of thin air, and these gods and goddesses morphed into different forms. The group that settled in Iran became Zoroastrians, and they morphed the proto-Indo-European gods into Iranian gods. Whereas the group that settled in the Norwegian, the Swedish, and the Danish regions, these same gods and goddesses were morphed by them into Viking Norse gods and goddesses, and the group that migrated into India, according to the Aryan invasion theory, made what we call as Hindu gods and goddesses, and all these are equally fictitious. Is what modern ethno-linguistics. This is how modern ethno-linguistic treats divinity itself. But the Vedantic view tries to bridge that gap by saying that while at the observational level, yes, migrations, social shifts, etc., do influence language, there is also a metaphysical level to it wherein devas are real. Celestial events that occurred on the earth in past yugas that influenced human development as we know it today is also real, and therefore the Vedantic viewpoint towards language comes with a metaphysical divine element that modern linguistic completely discards. And this is the most fundamental difference as to why the Sanatani viewpoint is very different from the modernist viewpoint on the development of human languages and civilizations. Again, a bunch of sentences I've put across uh, in order to let you know how you can be very easily tempted to think that Sanskrit is that Proto-Indo-European is the origin of everything, and Sanskrit itself comes out of Proto-Indo-European. But when it comes to the Sanatana Dharmic viewpoint, despite all these similarities between these languages, it entirely says that we cannot conclude anything on these bases. If you see the top left, the first example, Etat ekam dhama asti, this is a home. When said in Old Russian, it will become Yetot odni doma jest. When said in Gothic, it will become Tata ein Heima ist. And of course in English, that is a home. So mama priya pita asti, Sanskrit. In Avestan, it will become Ho asti mana priya pitar. In Greek, O ine mophilos pateras. In Gothic, Sa is mein liefs father. Old English, he is mein lieflik father. And in modern English, he is my loved father. Rajnyah rajyam swadhama asti. It literally means the king's kingdom is his home. And I've given you an alternative sentence. Kshatriyasya kshatram swadhama asti. The realm of the Kshatriya is his home. If you say this in Avestan, Kshatraya he kshatrem hvanmana asti. Latin, regem regnum swam domum est. In Armenian, peti petutun ratune. If you can compare this with a Sanskrit equivalent, patyuhu patitvam tadhama asti. By hearing all this, you might be tempted to say, oh, everyone came in one particular way. No, don't be so quick to conclude anything out of this, because while the Sanatani does believe that the Vedic civilization is the foundation of all human civilization, the Sanatani should also have the discernment that non-Vedic civilizations that evolved independent of the Vedic civilization also have their own uniqueness, and everything inside those civilizations cannot be directly attributed to the Vedic civilization itself. There may be indirect ways to attribute them, but we should be very careful to not try to join dots that don't even exist and get into the controversial space of everything coming necessarily from one place and a migration necessarily happening from in only one direction, and that everything linearly developing in a unidirectional way. Nature doesn't work that way. An example of this, as I've written in the bottom left over here, the alphabet Jha does not even occur in the Vedas, but it's there in Sanskrit. The Pancharatra Agama says so. Then why does it not occur in the Vedas? A modern linguist will say, oh, because at the time when the Vedas were made, the sound was not developed. Then later on, Indic people made the sound. But the Sanatani viewpoint completely discards this, because the Sanatani cannot accept this. It goes against the Pancharatra Agama. Likewise, the sound La. It occurs in the Vedas, but it doesn't occur in the Itihasa Puranas. Does this mean that by the time the Itihasa Puranas came, the sound la fell out of use? And if that were true, if by the time the Itihasa Puranas were compiled, if the sound la went out of use, how does it exist in Marathi? How does that sound exist in Kannada? How does it exist in Telugu? Therefore, we cannot conclude that one phonetic came after one phonetic, one came before, one came from another. There is no way to conclude this. So we don't get into that mess. On the whole, what do we say about languages in general? Migrations, did they happen? Yes. But are they the sole reason why civilizations came up? No. Did one sound come necessarily from another sound? Partly, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Is one civilization always going to be the attributable origin of another civilization? No, not necessarily. One group of people from one civilization could have laid the basis for some other civilization. That doesn't mean that the civilization that is now going to grow does not have any external influence whatsoever. It can be influenced later on by so many other things and it can go its own way. So languages don't come one from the other like a mother, like a son from a mother's womb rigidly. No, doesn't work that way. Even if we take a child being born to a parent, once the child has come out of the mother's womb, it is its own individual. The same way even languages and civilizations work. A small aspect of it may have come from some other language or another civilization, but it doesn't mean that its evolution thereafter is only going to be tied to the mother civilization. Should we even say use the word of mother civilization? That also becomes a little controversial, because a civilization from which a group went somewhere else, they could have mingled with people who already existed over there and they could have formed something new, and over a period of time they have become an entirely different entity. But they may carry certain cultural memories from the various places from where they came, thereby showing similarities in their religious beliefs to religious beliefs elsewhere. For example, the Indra killing Vritra story, it has similarities to Odin killing Ymir, it has similarities to Afretun killing Ajdaha. But this is probably because certain ancestors who of these civilizations carried fragments of Vedic wisdom into these lands, mixed with the people over there, and those fragments morphed into something else according to the gunas and the karmas of the people over there, and it took on a different story angle itself. Thus, we cannot state categorically that things have a single source, because things can over a period of time be influenced by so many different actors that by the time it takes a certain shape, we can say that it has 20 mothers and 30 fathers. Nature is such. We can't categorically say that things happened only in one particular rigid manner. So the Sanatani view of the evolution of languages does not say that the modern view is entirely wrong, but it doesn't say it's entirely right. It fills various loopholes, it gives it a much broader base, and it removes all the rigid constructs that one civilization necessarily came from another civilization, and it brings in the metaphysical divine element of things coming out of God's body, and humans coming out of various lineages of rishis and prajapatis, and those humans later on taking their own karmic trajectories over a period known as yugas, and in that period of time they going their own ways. But in all these great journeys that humans have taken throughout yugas, they do carry the fundamental fragments of remembered human wisdoms and experiences dating back to the Krita Yuga, which we call as the time of Manu himself, and thus the religious beliefs of the Japanese Shinto, the Zoroastrian in Iran, the Eskimo living in Alaska, and the Sanatani living in India, they are very, very similar. They do carry fragments of their first creationary ancestors, but immediately after that creationary phase is over, they all go their different ways and they all land up in their different ways. As a conclusion, we note that Sanskrit, it should be known, is not a human language in the traditional sense from the Sanatani viewpoint. It is a divine cosmic sound system that pre-exists even humans. It pre-exists even Brahma's existence. It pre-exists anything. It's eternal. It's there in Vaikuntha. Vaikuntha has no start or finish. It's timeless, limitless, and it is outside the void of Prakriti itself. It has always been there and it shall always be there. And therefore, as long as Sanskrit is over there, Sanskrit is eternal. And Sriman Narayana, from the Shuddha Sattvika swaras of Sanskrit, allows those sounds to take their own courses according to the karmas of Jivatmans within Prakriti Mandala, and therefore various sounds, not just human languages, but even the sounds made by animals, gain basis in nature. Sounds tell us the story of the karmic trajectory of a particular creature. A rishi, if he heard the sound made by a particular human in a totally different language, even if he doesn't understand the language, the rishi will have the power to know that the quality of the sound reflects something about that person's gunas. He can use it to look into his karmic past, and he can use it to look into his ancestors' karmic past and reconstruct an image of where exactly that person's lineage comes from. This was the power of rishis, and they had a divine eye to do it. We cannot do this today. It's not just knowledge, they had a divine eye to hear a sound and hear the history of that lineage of the maker of the sound. There's an ability that we have lost today. Therefore, since everything boils down to the quality of sound, make Sattvika sounds always. What is a Sattvika sound? A sound that evokes Shri and Narayana to mind. Full stop. This is a Sattvika sound. That is why the greatest moral of Bhagavata Purana, Mahabharata, and one thing that Vedavyasa keeps repeating everywhere, keep saying Shri and Narayana's name all the time, because that takes you closer to them, and that is the intention of Sanatana Dharma. You make Rajasic sounds, you will go far away from them, and you will fall ultimately into Tamasika sounds, which instill ignorance and all bad qualities in you and ensure that you never go near them for a very long time to come. And thus, human languages themselves are classified on the basis of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, and the admixture of these three gunas. In the same way, humans themselves are classified as Sattvika, Rajasika, and Tamasika. As usual, shout out to Dakshina Vrindavan for doing a splendid job of protecting our divine race of cows. I would urge you, as I always do, to at the end of these episodes, to try and adopt a cow or a bull, or at the very least, visit them, keep in touch with them, and help them rescue cows and bulls from slaughter, and serve the divine race of cows and bulls. Wherever you are, please continue doing Go Seva. Even if you are not capable of doing any other dharma, this one dharma shall take you closer to Shri and Narayana. Srimate Narayanaya Namaha.